Welcome back. Today we're going to talk about copper. So copper is one of the minerals that is most commonly deficient across the US and of course here in Nebraska. In forage-based diets, copper deficiency is quite common and we do need to supplement it. Where we see challenges with copper is really in our baby calves. So copper is extremely important in terms of the immune function, white blood cell formation, antibody formation. And so what we see is that copper deficiency has often been associated with diarrhea as well as just reduced growth of calves. And in fact, we usually will see that way before we'd ever see an effect on the cow. But when we talk about copper, we have to first start out understanding the concept of bioavailability. So when we think about minerals, you have to understand that no mineral is an island, and often minerals interact with each other. In the case of copper, copper is affected by the molybdenum and the sulfur content of the forage or the diet, as well as actually many other minerals. Zinc and iron all interact with copper in terms of affecting its bioavailability. So what is bioavailability? Well, bioavailability really is about how much of that mineral actually gets into the body. So the concentration that is in the feedstuff doesn't actually equal the availability. You can kind of think about it like a donut. When we consume something, it's like going into the donut hole. It's not truly in the donut until it gets absorbed across the intestine, and then it would be like being absorbed into that donut. So bioavailability is really about how much of that mineral ends up actually in the body versus being excreted in the manure. Antagonists are other elements, in this case minerals, right, that are inhibiting the absorption or the transport of another mineral. So really what we think about with the case of copper is that sulfur and molybdenum actually can bind to the copper and cause it to actually be excreted out of the body and not be available, of course. This is what we talk about when we talk about secondary deficiencies. You know, if you look at the concentration that might be in the diet, you might say, oh yeah, we have plenty of copper, but because of these other minerals that are affecting the absorption, we actually don't have enough to actually meet the needs. Well, what do? Well, honestly, usually we just feed more. So when we think about these mineral interrelationships, we have to take those into account to make sure that we're actually meeting the needs of our cows and their calves in this case. So let's look at the copper concentration in our grass pastures. So similar to some of the previous episodes, I have it kind of broken down by the quality of the forage. So we go from fair to premium, and this good and premium here is going to be similar to what you might expect in pasture. That lush green forage is going to be in that premium range. And when you get into some of the drier forage kind of later in the season, you're going to be in the good range. And then, of course, if you're into like dormant season, you might be into fair or even worse. Now, I have this broken down into two groupings because we see that really there's not much difference in the copper content or the molybdenum and sulfur content across most of Nebraska in our grasses. Eastern Nebraska, on the other side, is a little bit different, and it's mostly because of the molybdenum concentrations being a little bit lower in eastern Nebraska. That's a good thing in that it actually means that you have less antagonism or less interference with your copper. Okay, so what's the copper requirement of our cows? We say it's 10 parts per million. We say actually it's 10 parts per million for all cattle. And we do not have a difference in requirement depending on lactation or just dry pregnant cows. And really, part of that is because there's very little copper in the milk, and thus there's not a lot of extra excretion of copper like there would be for our macro minerals. The other thing is that, as we talked about earlier, our micro minerals like copper is stored, and so we can use those stores in times when we're not meeting the needs. So it's very actually hard to get very specific and targeted. So 10 parts per million is what we say the requirement is. So relative to that 10 parts per million, if we just look at total copper in our forages and we look at this premium and good, we see that we're running around 80 to maybe 60% of the requirement. So we're not looking too bad, right? The problem is that we have the sulfur content and the molybdenum. And the thing to point out here is that as our forage quality gets better, meaning our maturity gets less, we do have higher concentrations of copper, but we also have higher concentrations of sulfur and molybdenum, and they are interfering with the absorption. So if we go down here to available copper, we see that because of the concentrations in most of Nebraska of molybdenum and sulfur, we have very little copper that's actually available. We are less than 10% of the copper requirement. If we look at eastern Nebraska, things look just a teeny bit better because our molybdenum concentrations are just a little bit lower. And so now we're at 30 to maybe 15% of the requirement. So we need to be providing, basically 70 to 90% of the requirement. So what does that look like? Well, in a 4-ounce free choice mineral, 130 parts per million in that mineral is equal to 1 part per million in the diet. So if I wanted to supply the full requirement here, I would supply 1,300 parts per million. And actually, this bolded range here is kind of where we typically target our free choice minerals. And the reason is, as I showed you, we were about 90% of the requirement that we were deficient, and we haven't taken into account any other interactions. So nothing with zinc or iron or even phosphorus. And so typically, the minimum we usually suggest is really probably this 1,300 parts per million. If we have very high antagonist loads, like you have high sulfate water, or maybe you're in a pocket that has even higher molybdenum, there are those around, you may need to be up here in this 2,000 to maybe even 2,500 range. But generally 13 to 2,000 is going to be meeting the needs of our cows in Nebraska.